from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, getting out of Dodge, the Senate prepares to leave Washington until after Labor Day, if they can accelerate the process for key votes, including government funding and the confirmation of Todd Blanche as Attorney General. We're tracking it all tonight, and we'll have more with Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware ahead. Plus, a downside job surprise. A negative July jobs print takes some pressure off Kevin Warsh and the Fed to raise interest rates. We'll get into the details and the reaction from National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett. And Trump's revived threat. The president is once again threatening to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook over unproven allegations of mortgage fraud. What his new letter to her says and what it means for the fight over Fed independence. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew.
We kick off our coverage tonight with a dizzying pile of work facing senators trying to address all of this before leaving town for the 5-week August recess. The action that we are tracking today, passage of the Lindsey Graham Russia sanctions bill, a procedural vote on a stopgap funding measure to avoid a government shutdown the end of next month, and votes on dozens of President Trump's nominees. All this as the president's pick for Attorney General moves a step closer to confirmation, with Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy announcing on the Senate floor today that he will vote in favor of Todd Blanche, despite previously articulated misgivings and the fact that President Trump primaried Cassidy right out of a job. The question this evening is what else, if anything, will get done. Let's ask a senator. We're joined by one right now, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. I'm glad to say is with us, who serves on the Foreign Relations, Judiciary and Appropriations Committee. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Forgive us for treating you as a bit of a reporter this evening, but I know this is moment to moment. What is the state of play right now in the Senate with regard to a timing deal on floor votes? Or are you getting on the Acela tonight?
So, Joe, no, I don't think I'll be leaving anytime soon. We're going to be fighting, frankly, with each other for the next couple of hours about who gets an amendment vote, at what threshold, and what's the impact. How does this really matter? First, the most important thing we will do is to vote to keep the government open through December. I expect we will pass that before we leave. And I think that's important, not just for all the government employees who don't want to have to be furloughed again, but also to avoid the impact of a shutdown on our reputation and our operations globally. Second, we have passed the Lindsey Graham Russia Sanctions Act, as you referenced. And as someone who has long supported tougher sanctions on Russia to help deter them from their aggression against Ukraine, I thought that was an important thing for us to get done today. I'm also an original co-sponsor of the Protect College Sports Act, something I've worked hard on with Republican Senator Ted Cruz and Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell. Anyone who is a college sports fan knows that between the transfer portal, sky-high salaries for coaches, lots of different changes in conferences and playing, and the name, image, and likeness payments that college players have earned, it's a rapidly changing landscape. And I think this is a good bipartisan compromise to stabilize college sports. There's a number of other things like Todd Blanche's confirmation and the nominations you referenced. I think we can get them all done and get out of here tonight, but we'll see.
Wow.
It's not good to bet on the Senate getting its work done early.
Well, as you talk about the Protect College Sports Act, the president is a fan of your bill as well, Senator. He actually just posted on True Social saying the Protect College Sports Act is a great bill and the Senate will hopefully stay in D.C. until it passes. Is that your expectation? Would that be tonight?
That's my hope. If you read further into President Trump's Truth Social post, he's also specifically pushing back on a mischaracterization of this bill by one of my colleagues. He doesn't name Josh Hawley, a Republican senator from Missouri, but Senator Hawley and several others are spreading the false rumor that this bill, if it became law, would actually prevent state laws that were passed in order to prevent people from playing a sport other than the gender they were born with. That is an issue that doesn't impact this law, and we shouldn't be staying here for another day or two just to take up a vote on the Hawley amendment. It is unusual, but President Trump and I are on the same side on this one. This is a good compromise. We should take it up and pass it.
Well, you show up long enough, you end up seeing everything. Senator, you mentioned Todd Blanche. As we wait for news on a timing deal, I think is the state of play right now with all of the items you mentioned otherwise. Is he as good as the next attorney general?
He may very well be confirmed here, but I think my Republican colleagues will come to regret voting for him. Todd Blanche, as the assistant attorney general and now as the acting attorney general, was responsible for the rollout of the Epstein files. I'll remind you, President Trump ran on releasing the Epstein files and then dragged his feet, first under Pam Bondi, now under Todd Blanche. And Todd Blanche mishandled it so badly that a number of the Epstein victims were harmed as a result. He hasn't been transparent. He hasn't been rapid. Frankly, the Epstein files have been a dumpster fire under Todd Blanche. An even worse idea, and even more poorly executed, was the $1.8 billion weaponization fund, a slush fund to make payments to those who felt they were wronged by the Department of Justice, specifically including those who were convicted of assaulting police officers here on January 6th. I pressed Todd Blanche about this in his confirmation hearing, and that was the issue that initially led Republican Senators Cornyn and Cassidy to oppose his confirmation. They accepted a thin paper, a signed commitment by Todd Blanche that he wouldn't move ahead with the weaponization fund. So what's my beef? Well, President Trump keeps saying, as recently as last weekend, that he wants this weaponization fund to move forward and to make payments. And he wants the get out of jail free card, the settlement with the IRS that prevents Trump and his family and his businesses from ever being held accountable for tax cheating. I'm concerned that Todd Blanche is more loyal to Trump than he is to the Constitution and to justice, and that once confirmed, he will simply flip his position and do what President Trump wants. I hope that's not the case, but given experience, I suspect it will be.
Well, Senator, it sounds like you're not buying the argument that was made by your colleague, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who, of course, was leaving us guessing as to whether or not he would vote to confirm Blanche and announced that he would on the Senate floor, saying in part that any attorney general could face a similar problem in terms of President Trump wanting to use the Department of Justice to go after perceived enemies, but also that Mr. Blanche is best suited for the role because as his former personal attorney, he would be able to be honest with the president and push back. That doesn't sound like a solid argument to you?
No, because there's no evidence that Todd Blanche has done that. Yes, he was President Trump's personal criminal defense attorney. Yes, he sees himself as loyal to President Trump and his agenda. No, there's no evidence that that has led him to actually push back on terrible ideas like the weaponization fund or the indictment of either journalists who are alleged to have inappropriately leaked or those who President Trump views as his personal political opponents. I'll remind you, President Trump publicly berated Pam Bondi for not having succeeded in convicting people like James Comey or Letitia James. Comey, the former FBI director, James, the New York Attorney General, who indicted and prosecuted Donald Trump. That's not a reason to then vote for Todd Blanche when he also has shown a willingness to advance that agenda. We should be trying to move away from the weaponization, from the partisan utilization of the Department of Justice to go after political enemies, not install permanently as the Attorney General of the United States someone who has shown more of an interest in being personally loyal to the president than standing up to him and saying no.
You know, you mentioned the Russia sanctions bill, Senator, and it's not often we talk without getting to geopolitics. I'd like to ask you about a report today, if you could put your foreign policy hat on here, a report in the Wall Street Journal that Vladimir Putin has now become so cornered that our intelligence apparatus has assessed that he could try to test NATO's resolve with a limited assault on a NATO country in the next few years to provoke NATO in this case. An assessment that changed earlier this year, according to officials, as he is increasingly squeezed in Ukraine. Have you seen that intelligence, and is that your expectation?
I have been briefed on this matter. I cannot talk about what I've been told in a classified setting. I have the highest classification of access to intelligence in my current role as the senior Democrat on defense and intelligence appropriations, but I can respond to what's in the newspaper and to what's been said publicly. Look, a year ago, the defense minister for Germany, one of our core NATO allies, warned that the Germans were seeing clear signals that Vladimir Putin was not just rearming after taking a pounding on the front lines in Ukraine, but was rebuilding the Russian military to a level that showed an intention to go beyond Ukraine and to likely try and test NATO and NATO's defenses. In several meetings that I've had in Europe and here in the United States with leaders of our Baltic allies, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, small countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, they've raised the alarm that Russia might very well try an on-the-ground incursion into their territory. So while I'm not telling you anything I've been told in a classified setting, the public accounts of our allies suggest that this is a real and a legitimate concern. That's why when last year's defense budget, as proposed by President Trump, cut to zero the funding for our Baltic Assurance Initiative and cut to zero our support for Ukraine and its defense, Senator McConnell and I and a number of other senators on the Appropriations Committee worked hard to restore funding for those activities that would reassure and invest in the shared defense of the eastern flank of NATO. Our NATO allies, our European allies, have genuinely stepped forward and taken on much more of the cost of their own defense and virtually all of Ukraine's defense. That's been a positive development in the last year. The United States is no longer bearing the majority of the cost of European defense. But we are sending, President Trump and Secretary Hegseth are sending signals that we are less committed to European security and less committed to European defense by abruptly withdrawing or reallocating or reassigning American troops and platforms, and by having the Pentagon do a review of our commitment and our level of force presence in NATO, in Europe. I think this is unwise. And the intelligence, as reported in the press, suggests that Russia will take full advantage of that opening if we don't reinforce our commitment to European security and to NATO.
All right, Senator, thanks for joining us, and good luck getting out of there eventually. Democratic Senator Chris Coons.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time. Now, President Trump is reviving his threat to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook over unproven allegations of mortgage fraud, according to a letter seen by Bloomberg, following the Supreme Court's ruling in June allowing her to remain in the job while she fights the president's bid to oust her. Trump's new letter to Cook, dated Wednesday, saying he is considering removing her and giving her until August 26th to respond to the allegations. For more, let's go to Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove at the White House, who reported on this story for us. So, Josh, if at first you don't succeed, try again?
Absolutely, Kayleigh. That's what this looks like, essentially using that Supreme Court decision, which was in some way a reprieve for Governor Lisa Cook of the Fed, to now kind of take another crack at it using the same root allegations. This is going back to last year's criminal referral related to mortgages and what one Trump ally has suggested in the past is improprieties on the part of Governor Cook. So now this letter went out Wednesday, signed by Dan Scavino, one of the president's top aides, to Governor Cook and to her lawyer, saying you have 21 days to respond to that. How far this will go is not entirely clear, but it does seem clear that the president is going to try to fire her again, and that presumably will lead to at least some sort of a legal fight once again. Now, if that Supreme Court ruling ultimately does give them some kind of playbook or guidelines to do that, then there's an open question here as to the fate of Governor Cook. Remember, our colleagues have also reported that members of the Trump world, for lack of a better phrase, are weighing whether they can try to also attempt to oust Michael Barr, another governor, in particular over his role in oversight of the Silicon Valley Bank situation. And of course, there are open questions as to whether the former chair, Jay Powell, how long he'll stay on the board as a regular old governor. And so a lot of moving pieces here. Trump is sort of really seems to still be interested in trying to remake the Fed, and so where we'll take it from here, we don't know. But the Governor Cook's lawyer is saying they plan to fight this one, and that they're saying it's based on sort of unfounded allegations just like the first one is. And so this one looks to be a battle that's shaping up that could take some time.
Josh, thank you for all your great reporting today. Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove with us live from the White House. As we turn now to Republican Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota, a member of the House Committee on Agriculture and House Select Committee on China. Congressman, thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm sure you're looking across the rotunda from the upper chamber, at least in spirit, to see what's happening in the Senate this evening. And it does appear that they are going to get their arms around a continuing resolution to keep the government funded beyond the end of September. You've already done this in the House. If it comes back with changes, do we have problems?
It'll depend on the nature of the changes. And I know so many of my colleagues in the House, they love to complain about the Senate, and clearly the Senate moves more slowly than the House does. And in general, we hate getting jammed by the Senate. And so if the changes are modest, then I think the House would be happy to take them up when we come back. If there are major changes, then I think we're going to have to fight about it a little bit.
Well, it becomes a question then of if that fight ultimately leads to a government shutdown in September. Congressman, if you don't pass what the Senate passes, how likely is that scenario, knowing that we've been told by a number of your colleagues that the feeling is Democrats would allow that to happen because they feel it doesn't hurt them as much ahead of the midterms?
Oh, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that Democrats want a shutdown. I mean, clearly a few of them do, but you got some people on both sides of the aisle who just love a fight and love to use any leverage they can. But remember, the House has already passed a continuing resolution. The Senate could take our work product, and then we would know that we wouldn't have a government shutdown on September 30th. The Senate's going second, and so if they make a few changes, I suspect we'll be okay with that. If they make big changes, we're just going to have to try to find some common ground. I do not think there'll be a shutdown. Shutdowns are stupid. They're always stupid. They hurt the American people. They certainly don't hurt the members of Congress who are the ones dragging their feet and causing this problem. So let's just be big boys and big girls and get our work done.
Well, if stupid were only a disqualifier in Washington. Congressman, do you have a take on the Clarity Act? It looks like it's being left on the side of the road by the Senate. They won't take it up until after recess, and some people think that's the death knell. How about you?
I do have a take on the Clarity Act. I'm one of the 4 authors of the Clarity Act, the House version, which was an exceptionally good piece of work, which is how we got 85 or 90 Democrats on top of almost all of the Republicans. For your viewers who don't know, the Clarity Act provides some basic rules of the road around digital assets and crypto. Every other member of the G20 has figured this out. Our country's lagging behind. We're not going to have the kind of innovation and the kind of investment we need if the digital assets ecosystem can't trust that we've got good rules of the road. The House version is really, really, really good. And yes, I have a fair amount of pride of authorship. The Senate has made a few changes. I don't like many of the changes they made. Some of them I think would be relatively easy for us to choke down. Others will be more difficult. But at this point, I'm just rooting for the Senate to get something done. And I know that both Republicans and Democrats at different times can be pains in the butt. I'm not generally the world's most partisan member of Congress. But I am at this moment far more frustrated with the Democrats. I think the Senate Clarity Act made a large number of concessions to Democratic views. I think that the Republicans in the Senate tried to meet the Democrats halfway. And I just think we're in a position right now where the Dems don't really want to play ball. That is not good news for clarity. And it's not good news for investment and innovation in our country.
Well, when you talk about the changes the Senate has made, obviously ethics provisions were a big question mark as to whether or not there would be an agreeable compromise to both sides. Would a forced divestiture of the president and his family's crypto holdings be an adequate compromise in your mind? Is that something, to use your phrasing, that the House could choke down?
The ethics provisions just conceptually are not that big a problem. Obviously, the devil, as we say, is in the details, but those aren't actually the issues that cause the most concern. I am a little disappointed, though, that the Republicans included some relatively strong language on the ethics reform around these digital assets. They had soft sign-off from a large number of Democratic leaders, good men and women who were working on this language. But it just feels like the goalposts keep moving. No matter what we offer, it's not quite enough to get the Democrats on board.
Really interesting. I know that you have a unique view as not only one of the authors, but as chair of the Digital Assets Subcommittee on this. Should the president have to divest or not? And what about community bankers in your district? They're still pretty worried about stablecoin yield. Do you see a deposit flight coming from the language as it's written?
I don't mind it if we want to tweak a little bit some of the yield-bearing language around stable coins. Yeah. I do think there's a happy medium to be reached here. This is not going to be a whole loaf win for the digital asset advocates, and it's not going to be a whole loaf win for traditional financial institutions. If we were going to turn that knob a little bit more one way or the other, I think certainly myself and I think the broader House could get on board with that. I'm not a guy who likes to pick fights and burn houses down. I'm a guy who likes to solve problems, so I will take 2/3 or 3/4 of a loaf on most anything. Same thing would be true with ethics reform. Listen, I just, in general, I don't think public officials, myself included, should be buying and selling individual stocks. I don't think we should be buying and selling individual crypto coins. Particularly in advance of a big vote. Even if it's not crooked, it looks lousy. And so I'm a big fan of some pretty strong ethics language around this whole arena.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on the other side of the recess. Republican Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota. We appreciate it. Now, we got a shock jobs report this morning showing a drop in payrolls. Well, the expectation had been 80,000+ jobs and a participation rate that fell to the lowest level outside COVID since the 1970s. NEC Director Kevin Hassett spoke to Bloomberg's Michael McKee about the figures earlier.
I think the labor story is still going to be positive. I just think that it's not going to be as positive as it typically has. If you go back over 40 years, the labor story adds about like 1 or 1.5% every year to GDP. I think now it's likely to be about half of that or a third of that.
And Michael McKee is joining us now for more. So, Mike, the markets didn't mind what it saw today in the jobs print. They feel like it takes the pressure off the Fed to hike as soon as September. Is that true?
Only to a certain extent, Kaylee, because we still have the inflation reports for the month to come. And that's really what the Fed is looking at, whether inflation is coming down in a way that will convince them they're on the way to the target of 2%. We get CPI next Wednesday. PPI follows that. There's another CPI report before we get to the next Fed meeting on September 16th. So right now, it's kind of tells the Fed they don't have to worry too much about the economy overall, but it doesn't really change the dynamic for the people who are focused on inflation.
Mike, what do we make of this participation rate? As Kaylee mentioned, lowest since the 1970s. Where have all the workers gone?
Well, they're gone out of the labor force. We don't know exactly where all of them are, but a number of them, I guess, are on planes back to their original countries because the president's deportation program has certainly clipped a lot of people out of the labor force, which Kevin Hassett admitted today. And that's what he was talking about. The fact that the labor force is smaller means that you will have less potential growth. He's hoping that the productivity gains they might see from AI will overcome that. But it is an ongoing problem from the United States, not just because we're losing immigrants, but because baby boomers are retiring and the labor force is getting smaller. That's why we were able to go down to 4.1% for unemployment, because there were fewer people looking for jobs.
Mike, outside of the actual figures, I want to talk about your interview with Director Hassett as well, because perhaps one of the best moments for us here at Balance of Power, who've spent a lot of this week talking about democratic socialists, was when you asked him what exactly his definition of socialism is. Remind us what he told you.
Well, he basically gave us the classic definition of socialism, which is that the government owns the means of production and distributes the results. And so I went on to ask him, what about the Trump administration and its decisions to buy shares in companies like Intel or MP Minerals and the golden share they have in U.S. Steel? And his argument was, well, yes, we do have some ownership, but we don't get to make the decisions, and that's the difference.
Okay. I now want to ask you how you define socialism, Mike. How did he do in his definition?
Well, I think that most people would say classically that socialism is the government owning the means of production, but I don't think that Democrats are actually proposing that. They're building a case on things like the New York mayor's decision to open some trial city-owned grocery stores in areas where grocery chains won't serve. That's not exactly building a factory or any kind of big kind of company that would owned by the government.
I'm just trying to figure out if the president knows the difference between socialism and communism. That's for another show, I guess.
Yeah, we'll have to get into that later. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Mike McKee. Great interview with Director Hassett. And we'll have another interview coming up here on Balance of Power with Democratic Congressman Greg Landsman of Ohio next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is not a referendum on President Trump. It is a decision regarding Mr. Blanche in very specific circumstances. All considered, I will vote for Mr. Blanche. I'll be criticized for this vote. What's new?
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And that was Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana on the Senate floor today, affirming that he will vote for Todd Blanche to be Attorney General, paving the way for the president's nominee to finally be confirmed by the full Senate, assuming they can get a vote in before the recess. At this hour, they are still trying to work out a time agreement to vote on Blanche, a continuing resolution to fund the government, and other issues. And joining us now for more on the many issues facing both chambers is Democratic Congressman Greg Landsman of Ohio, a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Balance of Power. One thing that the Senate has accomplished today, and we're not sure exactly how much else will be accomplished before they get out of town, is the passage of the Lindsey Graham Russia sanctions bill. This was a massive bipartisan vote. 86-11 would allow the president to put tariffs on countries that are buyers of Russian oil. This is now headed to your chamber, and I wonder if you are planning to vote for this legislation, if you expect the majority of your Democratic colleagues will, knowing that it does hand some tariff authority back to the president.
Yeah, the president has decided to do what he wants to do with the tariffs. I think Congress has to rein in the larger tariff authority that the president seems to think he has. It's been terrible for our economy. I haven't met a single business owner in my district that has benefited from these tariffs. Everyone has struggled from these tariffs. As it relates to the Russian sanctions bill, it's a big step forward in terms of holding Putin accountable for what he's done and continues to do in Ukraine. He has caused so much bloodshed and cost the global community so much money because of this invasion. And it's important for the world, certainly with the United States leadership, to push him back.
Well, with that said, we're talking sanctions and a lot of other issues this evening in the Senate, Congressman, and I'm sure that you've been following the bouncing ball from home in Ohio. There's a very good chance that there will be a timing deal. We just spoke with Senator Chris Coons that will allow votes on a continuing resolution among several other items. We've got the sanctions taken care of earlier today. If there's a continuing resolution that is passed here that requires House votes, if it comes back with changes, would you be on board? Or could we be facing a government shutdown at the end of next month?
Yeah, I'm more likely to support it based on the vote outcome in the Senate, though I have not read the CR and haven't been briefed on it. But it was a overwhelmingly bipartisan bill to keep the government open through, I believe, November, if not parts of December.
Yeah, December 11th is what the Senate CR is dated. I'd like to ask you, Congressman, about something that we've been told at least, could happen more immediately than that. It relates to geopolitics, as Iran has suggested for days now that they are close to finalizing an agreement with Oman over the Strait of Hormuz. And I ask you this with your seat on the Energy and Commerce Committee. If it seems acceptable to you that Iran and Oman are going to be able to work out some system to allow for the passage of commercial vessels through the waterway, get more energy flowing once again, if it does mean that they will get to exercise a degree of control.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem, and it's a problem of the president's making. You know, the initial strikes could have made sense if it was sort of an in and out kind of situation. They did this in June when they struck the enrichment facilities in and out, and there was some discussion at the beginning that that's what they were going to do here, but the weapon shield that was being built up around the enrichment facilities, so you know, some key weapons depot and maybe some of the naval vessels. But he has found himself in a protracted conflict and has been very reckless in terms of his rhetoric. And he doesn't have what's necessary to deal with something like this. One, the support of the American people. There's very little buy-in, and in large part because he didn't make the pitch, he didn't make the case. Two, no support from Congress. I mean, there are folks who are voting against the war powers resolutions, but he has not gotten a vote from Congress. And then three, there's no coalition. He did not bring on board the Arab countries, the Gulf states, Europe, all of which would be necessary to, you know, handle the situation in the Strait. Ultimately, you know, their blockade, his blockade, Trump's blockade, is about regime change, which is a mistake. And, you know, had they not done it, the international community would have put pressure on Iran to open up the Strait without something like this.
You know, I know you signed on to some war powers votes, and there will likely be more in both chambers. And I bring it up because margins could be changing, Congressman, and it could start in your state of Ohio based on what we're hearing here about Max Miller. There is a call for him to step down based on domestic abuse allegations. Of course, we saw a congressman from North Carolina announce plans in Greg Murphy to step down. I'm sorry, it's Congressman Murphy from
Chuck Edwards is the congressman who resigned. His neighboring district is Greg Murphy's.
Thankfully, Kayleigh Lyons is with me to keep my names straight. If we're in a world where margins start to drop because of, for instance, someone like Max Miller bowing out, does that make it more likely for war powers to pass?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I suspect that, you know, the war powers resolutions that are passing the House now to hold this administration accountable will pass the Senate. You know, they seem to be on a new timetable over there in the Senate. So it's only a matter of time. The question is whether or not Trump will listen to Congress. He obviously has to legally. You know, I suspect the courts will put pressure on him. But the idea that we have a president that ignores Congress repeatedly is a huge problem in terms of the democracy that has worked for the last 250 years.
I'd like to correct myself as well. It's been a long week for both Joe and I. Chuck Edwards will still be your colleague in the House of Representatives. He is just not seeking re-election, but he has not actually resigned his seat. We're now all clear on that. Max Miller also has not resigned his seat, and he has not ended his re-election bid. And I wonder, Congressman, if you believe if he does decide to stay in his race, if that affects the outcome on the statewide races that we are also watching. Obviously, there is a crucial Senate seat up for grabs in your state that Sherrod Brown is running for. There's a gubernatorial race as well. Is this all advantageous to Democrats?
I don't know. I think voters in Ohio are more concerned about the economy and how reckless the tariffs have been, the fact that Republicans have enabled this president. I think they're pissed about the corruption. You know, they're seeing this president and the folks close to him lining their pockets, making billions while they're struggling to pay their bills. They're frustrated about the health care cuts. They know that John Husted voted to pay for tax cuts by cutting health care for 500,000 Ohioans. And they're angry about the data centers and the fact that these folks have been passing out tax cuts to these data centers while the rest of us are trying to stop them coming into these communities unless they're going to pay for everything and protect our environment and our workers.
You know, I want to just ask you, Congressman, before you leave us, because you made this an important mission for yourself, and I know that you've worked with other lawmakers, including Mike Lawler, in fighting to keep Haitian immigrants here in the U.S. who had temporary protected status. Now that we know that they'll be leaving the country, to what extent will this impact your state when it comes to nursing homes, hospitals, and the community?
It's going to have a devastating impact. I mean, this is one of the more significant moral issues that I've been part of in my time in Congress. A couple of things for people to keep in mind. One, these folks have fled for their lives. Haiti has been, a very challenging place for decades, years. It's become even more violent because of the gang violence. Two, they have been working in large part in healthcare, in home healthcare, so taking care of our families. Three, if they go back, if Trump sends them back, as our Ohio Republican Governor Mike DeWine said, he will be sending them back to hell. That's how dangerous it is. And then the last thing that people should keep in mind is that the House, in a bipartisan way, passed a 3-year extension for these Haitian immigrants, 3-year extension of the temporary protective status. All the Senate has to do is take it up and pass it, and they will protect tens of thousands of lives.
Congressman, thanks for being with us. Greg Landsman, Democrat from Ohio. We appreciate the conversation today on Bloomberg. The Pentagon unveiling a new plan for defense contractors to access U.S. military bases to test new weapon systems. It's all part of the Defense Department's efforts to speed procurement. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall spoke today with Army Secretary Dan Driscoll at a testing site in Michigan.
This is a really big deal. It was a couple of months ago. I was out at one of our test ranges, and what I heard was that industry on average was having to wait between 12 and 18 months sometimes from the moment they wanted to get on our test range until we could give them access. And fundamentally, the problem with this is if you think of these innovative companies, if you think of the primes, everyone needs to be able to test their product, and they need to be able to learn from that. And the innovation loop that comes from actually using your thing in the real world makes all the difference. And so when we slow things down in the innovation loop by 12 or 18 months at a time, that is just bad for soldiers, it's bad for taxpayers, and it's bad for companies. And so what we're announcing today is basically a new front door to access all of the U.S. Army's, or many of the U.S. Army's ranges. We're layering in international partners. We're going to give concierge access, and we are going to aspire to get these companies onto our range within 30 days every single time.
So then after they're on that range, I think a lot of these companies are probably wondering how quickly can they get into business with the U.S. Army? If you like what you see, how do those purchases work from there? What sort of timeline are you eyeing for that?
So under President Trump, what we've been able to do is we've been able to reallocate dollars we already had. And so we created almost a $750 million venture-like model that has allowed us to get industry on contract sometimes in under 30 days. That is unbelievable. I mean, I think if you looked historically, the fastest time I had heard anyone ever reference was like 9 months, but on average it could be up to 2 years sometimes. And so our commitment to industry is we know that they need dollars from the U.S. Army in order to continue their innovation. We know that if we're asking them to come out and spend time with soldiers, get their products in the dirt and the mud, and to innovate, we have got to be there for them on the other side with actual hard dollars.
How are current conflicts highlighting the need for initiatives like this and for the U.S. Army to scale? Is there a new urgency here?
I think if you look at what's occurring in Ukraine, they have this existential risk to their nation that allows them to innovate very quickly. you would never want to have that risk as a nation. So what we're trying to do is synthetically create the conditions for innovation that can get as close to matching that environment as possible. And so one of the things we're doing here at Camp Grayling in September is we're creating an electronic warfare and a EW environment that is as close to what Ukraine has as we can create. We're inviting in small, medium, and large businesses from across our country. We're having soldiers come down, and we are trying to empower these incredible American innovators to do what they do best, which is to out-innovate the rest of the world.
So the Army lives off of annual budgets, right? How do you ensure that you're able to scale and grow initiatives like this in what is, I think it's fair to say, a pretty unpredictable funding cycle? And how much weight maybe does that put on the $67 billion supplemental package in terms of what the Army needs to get done?
So the quirk of the design of our democratic form of government is our funding is annual. It is oftentimes continuing resolutions, which means we can't do new starts on our spending. And that is full stop bad for soldiers. That is bad for our national security, and we must as a nation fix it. That being said, what we have tried to do is just accept that that has been the reality. I think 18 of the last 21 years we've had continuing resolutions. And so what the United States Army has been trying to do under Secretary Hexeth's leadership is innovate as fast as humanly possible with what we do have. And we feel very good that working with Congress and Senate and consolidating down some of our budget line items, we are getting more flexibility than we have had in the last couple of years, not as much as we had a couple of decades ago. And we are taking that and earning back the trust of Congress to give us even more going forward.
You can find Tyler Kendall's full interview with Army Secretary Dan Driscoll on the terminal and online. Coming up, the Senate is still in town, and it's not clear for how long or what they'll get done before they leave. We'll get the best guesses from our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
No, I don't think I'll be leaving anytime soon. We're going to be fighting, frankly, with each other for the next couple of hours about who gets an amendment vote, at what threshold, and what's the impact. The most important thing we will do is to vote to keep the government open through December. I expect we will pass that before we leave. And I think that's important not just for all the government employees who don't want to have to be furloughed again, but also to avoid the impact of a shutdown on our reputation and our operations globally.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Senator Chris Coons there talking with us at the top of the hour. The Democrat cautiously optimistic about the work ahead for the Senate over the next few hours, but who knows? Maybe our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano with us this evening, Democratic strategist and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. And Rick Davis is here, Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital. Rick, you spent a couple days in the Senate in your life. You've been there for nights like these. A timing deal is required. No one's talking. It's even the senator didn't know if they were going home at some point with work done or not. What's your expectation?
Yeah, what I'm hearing is Saturday in the Senate.
Okay.
They're going to release some of the gas and try and find a way to, maybe keep it up. Everybody stay in. They want to get some of these things done. And so, yeah, I do believe this will probably slide into the weekend. Much better than having this headache greeting them when they get back after Labor Day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, assuming that if it takes the weekend, it takes the weekend, but they get the job done in terms of passing things like the CR that the senator was talking about, Jeannie, it's going to be on to the House. And we just were told by Congressman Dusty Johnson that it's going to depend what the CR ultimately looks like because it's not the one the House passed. It's not clear the Russia sanctions bill that the Senate passed today. One of the things they have checked off the list will get through the House as well. August, clearly tricky for the Senate. September could be very tricky, too.
It's going to be very tricky. And, of course, what are they all thinking about when they come back from this break is going to be the midterm. So, I don't think there's going to be a lot of interest in having these big blowout fights. And, of course, the differences on the CR between the House and the Senate will be enormous. And these are going to be a lot of Republican fights because, of course, they own both of the bodies. Democrats Democrats will have their own views about all of these things. But even on the Russian sanctions bill, I think that it can pass the House. I think it probably will, but I think it's going to take Donald Trump getting personally involved to push it through. So we're going to have to see not just action in the House, but also, I think, from the White House to move these over the line.
I want to ask you both about what happened around 10:40 a.m. on the Senate floor. We were all told to watch because Bill Cassidy was going to announce his intention, how he would vote for Todd Blanche. We knew that he had misgivings about Blanche as Attorney General. We knew that he was at odds with President Trump, who primaried him right out of a job. And here's what he had to tell America.
This is not a referendum on President Trump. It is a decision regarding Mr. Blanche in very specific circumstances. All considered, I will vote for Mr. Blanche. I'll be criticized for this vote. What's new?
He actually got choked up while he was talking there, Rick, and he made the case that if we don't approve Todd Blanche, it could be worse. Some other acting attorney general. Do you appreciate the spirit of that decision, or are you disappointed in him?
It sounds like a cop-out to me.
Okay.
And I was really kind of stunned by his rationale. He called all these people, asked for their advice. You know, he went through this whole rationale, and he kept coming back to, Todd Blanche can't be trusted. And I was like, okay, then why are you voting for him? Oh, because the others would be worse. Right. Who are the others? I mean, honestly, it was the strangest rationale. The way I took it, and this is just Rick Davis, is he's leaving the Senate. He doesn't want, Donald Trump on his back. So go out with a nice wet kiss to the Donald, and that's it. Maybe somebody down there in Louisiana who's associated with him may need a job, and he doesn't want to be the impediment to that.
So maybe the YOLO caucus isn't really YOLOing that hard. That doesn't feel like a YOLO move to me, Jeannie.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't. And I wrote down, Kaylee, Donald Trump called him disloyal, a lightweight, a sleazebag. The list goes on, some I can't even talk about. Ended his political career. And his rationale, to Rick's point, is that Todd Blanche is going to act as a bulwark against Donald Trump's worst instincts, just as he did with what? The Epstein files. Oh, wait, no. Just as he did with the Epstein victims and the investigation. Oh, wait, no. Just as he did with the immunity deal. Oh, wait, no. Just as he did with the weaponization. I mean, none of what Cassidy said makes sense. And, what did he do with RFK Jr.? He is the reason we have RFK Jr. He didn't regret that enough, so he's jumping back into the fire. I mean, the rationale makes no sense. I could see why he was emotional, because he must be saying, what am I doing?
Wow. I'm not sure that was what was on his mind, Jeannie, but I wonder if Democrats are happy about the Clarity Act, crypto framework legislation apparently being left on ice here. Some think it just died on the vine.
Yeah, I mean, I think many Democrats, not all, feel like the ethics in that bill weren't strong enough. And then you hear from Donald Trump, and he says, why should I be treated differently? Why should my family be treated differently? We should be allowed to engage in this. Well, let's think about one reason. Because you're president of the United States. And this is what we mean about the problem with the ethics in that bill. So we should absolutely have legislation that should be worked on, but you've got to strengthen the ethics in a very corrupt Washington, D.C.
Amazing. They didn't get it done, Kaylee.
Yeah, the industry's not feeling too great about that. I can tell you that, because many people feel like if it gets punted to September, then it's kind of game over from there. Though Dusty Johnson would like to believe otherwise. One of the authors of Clarity is still holding out hope. Rick, can we talk about President Trump as well? Because he's been talking about a deal potentially being in the offing with Iran.
That's what we've been talking about.
But more him specifically, not how he relates to Congress. But today, the things he's decided to weigh in on or that have been reported are his ballroom, after a court ruled against him about being able to construct it. And apparently sending a letter to Lisa Cook warning he might try to fire the Fed governor again. Where are the president's priorities?
Yeah, and don't throw in birthright citizenship, right? He's taken a couple of EOs today on birthright that he's already lost in the Supreme Court. I mean, I think it's kind of random, considering all the weighty things that the Senate is actually working on, that he might want to influence what their outcome is, including his Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who, before Cassidy went on the floor, was being given last rites by the political popes of the Senate. It's kind of an odd dislocation of, I want to wander out here on some of these cultural issues, on some of these other things that really don't have a significant impact. And by the way, a negative political impact. One more conversation about the ballroom and another 5 Republican House members are going to lose their reelection. I mean, like, that's how a lot of political people in the Republican Party are looking at us right now. Can we just talk about affordability? Is there a possibility that the jobs report today might have deserved a little attention from the President of the United States?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry for getting all excited. There's a reelection occurring soon.
I love having you guys in studio. It's so much better.
It is really, arguably, he might not want to talk about a jobs report that had a negative 23,000 print on it, Jeannie.
Well, absolutely. But the political tone deafness of what he is talking about, all of these vanity projects, he's talking about the ballroom, he's talking about the arch, he's talking about the reflecting pool, Lisa Cook, the rest. It is politically tone deaf. Look at what's gone viral recently, the cost of a burrito, Katie Lyons, the cost of a burrito. That's what he should be talking about.
Yeah, we'll have to save the burrito conversation for another time. Jeannie Shanzano, Rick Davis, have a great weekend, and we'll see you on the Monday edition on Bloomberg TV and radio.